Welcome back everybody. Today marks an exciting milestone in our home lab journey. We're going to be taking all of what we've learned so far and we're going to be exposing our first container through a reverse proxy with SSL certificates. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to be using Traefik, which is a container first proxy, which is able to be dynamically configured through code and also is able to pull automatically valid certificates from the internet. So what does that mean? Well, at the moment, your Nginx container is simply being served over port 80 in HTTP. What does that mean? That's plain text. That means that that connection is not encrypted. So if anybody was sitting on your network, anyone was intercepting packets on your switch, they could see every single thing you are doing. And that's why there's been such a huge push over the past sort of 10 years or so to make sure that when you're going to websites, etc., you'll see that green padlock. Now, a green padlock in a browser means that it's using SSL encryption, and that encryption is valid, i.e. the certificate is issued by a valid authority. We're not going to get into that too much today, but you can go and read up about how that works. So by the end of this video, you'll have Docker serving Nginx containers through a Traefik proxy with valid SSL certs. One important thing to note for this video is you're going to need a valid domain. What does that mean? Well, just like google.com, youtube.com, you need a domain that you own. This allows you to point a domain to your IP address so that you can say mydomain.com and it's going to land at your IP address. With a valid domain, you can then be served valid SSL certificates to ensure that your traffic is end-to-end encrypted. Now, I recommend you go and buy a cheap domain. You can go to somewhere like Cloudflare and you can pick up domains usually for a few pounds a year. You don't need anything fancy for this. You can even use a free domain if you wanted to. And don't worry, you don't even need to have a static IP address. You can use dynamic DNS like I do, because I don't have a static IP address, and thankfully Sophos XG supports this out of the box, and I'll cover that in a later video. Now that you have your domain, you're ready to install Traefik. So let's head over to their website and have a look at the installation instructions. We're going to be installing this in Docker on our Docker VM. Now there's two ways you can do this. As I've shown you previously, you can actually do this really easily through the GUI on Portainer, and that's fine if you want to go and do that. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's also the Docker Compose way, which I recommend because you have granular control over the code. That's the way we're going to be doing it in this video, but again, you can just go to the catalog in Portainer and deploy Traefik that way. One thing that's great about Traefik is it has Let's Encrypt support built in. What's Let's Encrypt, I hear you say? Well, as I mentioned before, there's been a real drive over the past decade to get everybody onto HTTPS. Now, thankfully, there's a not-for-profit organisation called Let's Encrypt who have helped people on that journey. So they offer you free, valid SSL certificates. Free, valid? Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I've been using them for years, and I know a lot of other YouTubers in this space use it. Haven't had any issues, and I highly recommend them. So with that in mind, we're going to be using Let's Encrypt to pull our certificates using Traefik. So on the installation page, we want to find the instructions for Docker with Let's Encrypt. You'll also notice that there's a Helm chart. Now, don't worry too much about Helm charts. We'll get onto those when we do Kubernetes later on. But just to know, as this is a container first proxy, it's a great choice for Kubernetes. Another benefit of Traefik is that it has a great dashboard built into it, and I've showed you that on my previous videos. Now, the good thing about this is it's a read-only one, so in terms of security, not too much of a risk. It shows you all of the things that you'll need to know, and it's a great tool for debugging. It gives you a single pane of glass to make sure that your proxy is set up and configured properly and helps you pin down problems really quickly. So now that we've found the Docker installation guide with Let's Encrypt support, let's have a look at what that actually does. So just like before, we want to make a new folder within our Docker Compose folder just for Traefik, and we want to create a docker-compose.yaml file, and we're going to copy and paste that content in there. So the first thing you're going to note is it's version 3.3 and it's version 2.10 of Traefik. We're given the container name Traefik, that all makes sense. And then we're going to get into some interesting commands. So by using Let's Encrypt and pulling down valid certificates, there's a few changes to the default installation instructions that we need to make. There's also another slight nuance that you need to be aware of, although it doesn't matter which one you choose. You can validate your domain by using a DNS challenge or a TLS challenge. We're going to be using the DNS. So what does that mean? What's a DNS challenge? Well, as you know, a DNS, domain naming service, is the way that we find out the IP address for a website using a name. So when you type in google.com, it gives you the IP address so that your router, gateway, etc. knows how to find it. So in a DNS challenge, what Let's Encrypt is going to do is, with your credentials, which we'll provide in the config file, it's going to log in to your Cloudflare or whoever your domain registrar is, and it's going to create a temporary record. Now, when it does the challenge, it's going to look for that record in there. Now, it knows that you own the domain because only you could have written it, i.e. only you have access to the API or the login portal to be able to put that record in. So when it does that challenge and finds it, it goes, hey, yeah, you are you, therefore you can download and have a valid certificate. So not only does that certificate provide you with encryption end to end, it also verifies your identity. Now that's really important because you could have an encrypted tunnel to anybody. And I've said before that most malware nowadays will have an encrypted command and control center. So that means you can't actually see what's going in and out of your network. So the identity check works in a similar way with public key encryption. So they give you a public key to encrypt a message, you send that off, and only they can decrypt it because they have the private key. We're not going to go into too much, but have a look at public private key. It's basically how the internet works. And what that does is validates that only they could read that message, therefore they must be the holder of the private key, and therefore they must be who they say they are. Okay, thanks for sticking with me on the theory lesson. Now let's get onto the installation steps. So the first thing we want to do is to create some config files. Now the first config file we'll want is the Docker Compose. And now I mentioned that we're going to have to tweak that. Now I've tweaked mine to include the steps necessary to do this with a Cloudflare DNS registrar. The key parts you can see are in the environment section. So when you create and register your domain with Cloudflare, you need to go and create an API token. That's really simple. You just need to log in, go into your account settings and generate an API key. With those, just paste your email address and the API token here. We're also going to add some volumes, which, as I mentioned before, these are persistent volumes that will reside on your Docker VM. So the ones that we're most interested in are the config, the Acme and the Traefik YAML files. So the Traefik YAML is additional configuration settings for how we're going to generate those certificates, along with some other parameters such as entry points. The Acme is where the actual private key for the certificate is going to be stored, and then the config is just additional config parameters, but we're going to leave that blank for this video. The logs are pretty self-explanatory. You can tell Traefik to print the logs to a file in case you wanted to parse it elsewhere. We're not going to do that in this video, and later on we're going to use things like CrowdSec to actually look at our logs for us. The next bits of note in the labels section are we're going to enable Traefik, so enable equals true. We're going to create an entry point of HTTP. Now that relates to that port 80, as I said before. 80 is typically associated with HTTP traffic. We're going to create a URL for our dashboard. We need to generate a basic auth password, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment because it's base encoded. And I've also said that we want to create a redirect scheme here. So a bit like if you just typed in google.com, you wouldn't expect to have to go HTTPS. That should be implied, right? So what this will do is, regardless of what you type in, if you just put your domain name in, it will redirect you to the HTTPS port 443, and everything you do over that session will be encrypted. That then points you to that HTTPS entry point, so same as this entry point here. These are just as it says, ways to get into the proxy, i.e. what the proxy will listen to and respond to. That's going to use the same URL. It's going to have TLS enabled, and then there's some important bits just at the bottom here. So for our certificate resolver, we're going to use Cloudflare because that's where we have our domain registered. And I want it to generate certificates for both of these records. So Jim's Garage, this is the root domain. This is the highest level of the domain. And I also want to create a subdomain wildcard. So what does that mean? That basically means that with this certificate, I could have whatever I wanted .jimsgarage.co.uk, and it would say, fine, that's not a problem. So I could have Home Assistant or WireGuard or Plex or Jellyfin or whatever you want, that is possible. And then at the bottom, I've also enabled the API, which would allow you to do scraping and metric logs with things like Prometheus, so you can actually present your traffic logs in nice fancy Grafana dashboards. And we'll get onto that later. I showed you I have a few Grafana dashboards in my home lab. The last bit that's important on here is this networks proxy. What's that? Well, much like we've been virtualizing machines, Docker also enables you to virtualize networks. So we're going to create a network specifically for the proxy. Now this is a little bit like when I was talking about security through VLANs and multiple layers of networks. This is effectively the same, just within Docker itself. So we will be able to put containers onto this virtual proxy network that we want exposed to the internet, and those containers won't be able to talk to any other container on our network, which is pretty good for security, right? So to do that, we're also going to have to create that before we can use it, and I'll show you how to do that. Really simple, one command. So let's have a look at these configuration files and what we need to do for those. So I've gone into WinSCP and I've created those 3 files. I've just put them in my Ubuntu Docker /Traefik. So I have a /Docker compose /Traefik where I put my Docker compose file, and then I also have in the home directory just a /Docker where I put all of my persistent files. So in here I've created an acme.json blank file. Now it's important that with this one you change the permissions. It needs to have permissions of 600. If you have more permissions than 600, it will complain and say that it's overly permissive, because that would be a security risk, because it would mean that other users, other groups could see the private key, and that's not a good idea. Once you had that private key compromised, that certificate's no longer secure. As I mentioned before, the config for Traefik is blank in this instance, but there are a number of configurations options you could put in here if you had a more advanced setup. And lastly, the one that's important is this Traefik.yaml. So in here, you want to copy this configuration down, and it's basically building upon what we've put in the Docker Compose file. So we're saying that we want the API enabled. We're saying that we want an entry point of port 80 and we want it to redirect to port 443. We're going to secure skip verify. That's true. So what that means is it will ignore if there are any certificate errors internally. We're saying we want it to use the config file, but we're leaving that blank for now, just default. And then again, we're specifying what the certificate resolver is. So again, in this case, it's Cloudflare. And we're doing an Acme DNS challenge, as I said before. So you need to provide your email address here, the one that you register with Cloudflare. And then you need to say where you want to store it. And we've already said the acme.json file, that's where it's going to store your private key. And we're going to do a DNS challenge with Cloudflare. And the resolvers for our DNS are the Cloudflare IP. So 1.1.1.1 and 1001. Those are the primary and secondary DNS servers for Cloudflare. So we're going to say, go and use your own resolver, and this will hopefully speed it up a little bit. I'll drop all of these files into the description, and I'll put those on my GitHub page. It's also worth noting that you can create all these files, or you might actually argue you should create all these files through the command line. And I'll put those commands up on the screen just so you have awareness. You really do need to get familiar with these commands, as it will make your life so much easier in the future. But hey, we're keeping it simple for now. So let's go ahead and create our network for Traefik. And there you go, that's created. We can verify that with Importainer. And there it is. So as I mentioned, we need to generate the dashboard password. So I'll show you how to do that. So first of all, we're going to do a sudo apt update just to get the latest versions of all the files we need. Put the password back in. Once that's pulled, we need to run the next command. So here you can see we're installing a utility called Apache 2 Utilities. I'm not going to bother updating these just because we don't need to update them just to run this simple command. So then moving on to the command itself, we want to create a password and we need to replace the user and the password. So delete the brackets, delete the capitals, put in your username and your password. Those are the only things you need to change. So let me just change mine to something simple. So I've changed mine just to admin. It goes without saying, don't use this. And there you can see it spat out this code here. So what you want to do is copy that code and then paste it into your Docker Compose config file where it says the password for the dashboard. So now that you've got that in place, we're pretty much ready to go. So let's get this container running and let's check the logs to make sure that it pulls down the cert correctly. Here we go. Let's change directory to where our Docker Compose file is. And then we're going to run the same command we've always ran for spinning up a container. And let's see what happens. So there you go. The container was pulled. The container was started. Now let's check Importainer to see if that container is running. Everything looks fine. Let's have a look at those logs. That looks fine. It loaded the configuration from that traefik.yaml file that we specified. Excellent. So let's check then. Hopefully, if we go into the folder, the acme.json file was empty. We'd created a blank file. Let's refresh and see if that's still blank. Excellent. There's 16 kilobytes worth of data now in that file. So let's have a look inside there. And there we go. We can see that we've been generated a private key for both of the certificates that I requested. Fantastic. So you can now go to your dashboard and you can view the Traefik dashboard using HTTPS, i.e. it's encrypted and it's valid. Excellent. One thing to note, that URL probably won't resolve. What does that mean? Well, you're going to type in traefik-dashboard.yourdomain.com and it's going to say, no, error, it can't find it. That's because you haven't specified the IP address on Cloudflare. You want to do that internally. Now you can either store that in your host's configuration file, so you would put traefik-dashboard.yourdomain.com and point it to the internal IP address of your Docker host. And the way I do that is through Pi-hole as an internal DNS resolver. I'll be covering that shortly in some of the upcoming videos about how we deploy that. But for now, let's get on to something that we actually would want to do. So for example, we might now want to host a website with our Nginx container, and we can absolutely do that now that we have a valid SSL certificate and we know that our traffic's going to be encrypted. So what steps do we need to take next? Well, we're going to have to change our Nginx container. We're going to have to tell it now to sit on the proxy network, and we're going to have to fill out that labels section similarly to what we did to the Traefik container. We're going to have to tell it to use things like we want the website address, we want it to be redirected as HTTPS, and we need it to sit on that proxy network that we created. We also will have to port forward on our firewall. Thankfully, in Sophos XG, This is super easy. So let's start with that first step. Let's recreate our Nginx container to sit on the proxy network, and we need to add all of the configuration options to make it use the certificates we've just created. So going back to our Nginx configuration, I've now changed that Docker Compose file to include those labels and the network proxy. So not going to go through that again, but as you can see, it follows the same schematic as the Traefik container, and pretty much any container that you now want to run through the proxy and get all the benefits of a valid SSL certificate is as straightforward as copying that label block and putting it into the Docker Compose file. It's a really efficient way to take advantage of Traefik and all that it offers. So go ahead and delete your previous container for Nginx. Don't worry, deleting the container will not delete the persistent data on the host. It will simply delete the container. So when you respin this up, if you created a website or you have files in there, it will create the new container and it will load all of those files back into it. Again, demonstrating the benefits of containers and their ephemeral nature. So let's run the Nginx container again and let's see what happens. So there we have the container downloaded and deployed without any errors. Let's refresh with Importainer, and we can see that my Jim's Garage Nginx container is available. Let's check the logs. Everything looks fine within there, and we can log into the Traefik Dashboard and just validate that that's working. Now don't be alarmed, this is my production, my live environment that I'm running in Kubernetes because I run Traefik in Kubernetes. But the dashboard will be the same, except mine's going to have a lot more stuff in it. But you should be able to see now the Nginx container that you spun up. You should see your entry point at the top on that port 80 and port 443. And if we go in and have a look at the HTTP services at the top, you should see in here your whatever you named your site. So on mine, I just called it Jim's Garage. And here you can see this Jim's Garage is here. So that takes us on to the next step in our configuration. We now have our website hosting our content with a valid SSL certificate. Excellent. The only problem is nobody externally can access that. So how are we going to fix that? Well, you've already got your IP address added to your domain record. So when you query yourdomain.com or whatever it is, it's going to be able to find your home server. The problem is Sophos XG is set up to default deny block, i.e. no ports are forwarded, so there's no traffic getting through. Thankfully, this is really simple and there's an automated wizard in Sophos XG to do that. So let's get on to that. So all you need to do is log into Sophos XG. And on the left, you need to go to the Rules and Policies menu. Within Rules and Policies, click on the Add Firewall Rule button. And you'll want to click Server Access Assistant, DNAT. Now I told you a bit about that before, so this is simply a NAT, a network address translation, but the D stands for destination. So let's click that. Now, it's going to say, where do you want this traffic to go to? Select a host. So, on here, you can select your host for your Docker VM. So, as I mentioned before, we want to create a static host, a static IP for that host. And then we can just simply reference it in here. If you haven't done that, you can simply put its IP address in. But I recommend that you go ahead and create a static IP for it. So I have my Docker host selected. You're going to just click Next. You're going to select your IP address, your WAN address. So in my case, that's port B. You're going to click Next. The next is going to show you the services you can access. Now, what's a service? Well, in this case, it's simply what Sophos XG calls common ports. So, for example, HTTP would be a service that opens port 80. HTTPS would be a service that's port 443. You kind of get the idea. So, again, where we've gone onto hosts and services, you can add your own service and give it a friendly name. So for this one, we simply want to add HTTP and HTTPS. So just go down, tick both of those and hit apply, then click next. This is just validating where people can come from externally to access your service. Now, because we're wanting to open it up to the internet, we're going to say any. Now, you can also put geo blocks on top of this as a separate firewall rule. What's a geo block? So there might be certain countries, territories, etc. that you don't want to be able to access your website. So you can just block that by putting an IP range block in. And that's actually nice and friendly with Sophos XG, as they give you the country names because they're typically assigned an IP block. Now, as you know, anyone can get around that with a VPN, but it does help to cut down a bit of traffic. So just hit next. And then this is going to give you a summary of what the rule will do. Any traffic that is hitting your firewall on port 80 or port 443, it's going to send it to your Docker host on that port. Now, we have bound traffic to port 80 and port 443. So that traffic will hit the firewall will route, it will forward that on, port forward, it will forward it to the traffic host. The traffic host will be able to intercept what the domain name was, so in my case Jim's Garage, and it knows that Jim's Garage is assigned to the Nginx container. If, for example, it was a plex.jimsgarage or a jellyfin.jimsgarage, it would also know that and be able to route it to the right container. And again, this is why Traefik's really awesome, because it's dynamic. So you can just dynamically assign subdomains, domain names to it, and it will automatically figure out and route all of that traffic for you. So go ahead, click save and finish, and then that will deploy that rule. And fingers crossed, you should now be able to type your domain into your address bar and hit your Nginx website. So let's go and test that out. And there we go. We can see Jim's Garage. Yeah, bit of shameless self-promotion there. And the reason why we've done all of this, let's click that padlock. Connection is secure. Good. Let's have a look at that. Certificate is valid. Let's inspect that. And there we go. Common name, Jim's Garage, provided by Let's Encrypt. It was issued a few days ago, because I'd recorded this earlier, and it expires on the 16th of August 2023, and it will automatically be renewed every 3 months by Traefik. You can see the fingerprints for this certificate, and you can also see more details if you want. So hopefully now you have everything in place to enable internet users to access your web server securely. I'll see you on the next video. Take care.